was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. After months of working long hours at my law firm in Chicago, I finally had a chance to take a break. The plan was simple: fly out to Cape Cod, spend a few days at our grandmother's beach house, and enjoy the place that had been a constant in my life since childhood. The house had been in our family for generations, a cozy two-story retreat with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and a view of the ocean that always seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of place where you could hear the waves at night and wake up to the salty scent of the sea. I hadn't been back in over a year, but I wasn't worried. My sister Emily had been looking after it. She lived just an hour away in Boston, and since I was out of state, we had agreed she would take care of maintenance and anything else that needed to be done. It seemed like a fair arrangement. At least, that's what I thought. My first indication that something was wrong came when I pulled into the driveway. The house looked different. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Then I noticed the flower beds. Grandma had always kept them neat, and even after she passed, Emily had made sure to maintain them. But now they were empty, just patches of dirt where roses and hydrangeas had once bloomed. The porch swing, where we used to sit as kids, was gone. The front door, which had always been painted a soft shade of blue, was now a stark white. Something felt off. I grabbed my bag from the car and headed up the steps, fishing my key out of my pocket. The moment I slid it into the lock, my stomach dropped. The key didn't fit. Confused, I tried again, but it was no use. The lock had been changed. For a second, I thought maybe Emily had just replaced the locks and forgotten to tell me. It wouldn't have been the first time she forgot to mention something important. Annoyed, but not yet alarmed, I pulled out my phone and called her. It rang twice before she picked up. "Hey," she said, sounding surprised. "Hey, Emily, I just got to the house. My key doesn't work." There was a long pause on the other end. Then she sighed. "Jack, I was going to tell you. I really was." I frowned. "Tell me what?" There was another silence. And that's when the uneasy feeling in my gut turned into something worse. "Emily," I said sharply, "what's going on?" She exhaled, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I sold the house." The words hit me like a slap. "You what?" "I had to," she said quickly, as if rushing to justify herself. "I was struggling, Jack. The market was good, and it made sense." I couldn't even process what she was saying. The house, our grandmother's house, the place we had spent every summer since we were kids, was gone? "You had to?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Emily, this wasn't just your house to sell. We both inherited it." "I know," she said, but there was something defensive in her tone. "But you never come here anymore. You don't need it." I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. "That's not the point. How could you do this without telling me?" There was another long pause. When Emily spoke again, she sounded almost pleading. "I didn't think you'd care that much. You have your job, your life in Chicago. I was the one taking care of it. I thought I deserved to make the decision." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You thought you deserved it?" I let out a harsh laugh. "Emily, that house wasn't just some piece of property. It was Grandma's. It was our family's, and you just— What? Cashed out?" Her voice hardened. "I didn't have a choice, Jack. I was drowning in debt. The house was just sitting there. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to talk to me," I snapped. "We were supposed to decide together." Silence. I took a deep breath, trying to control the anger boiling inside me. "When did this happen?" 6 months ago," she admitted. 6 months, and she hadn't said a word. I had been calling her, texting her, checking in like nothing had changed, and the whole time she had been hiding this from me. I clenched my jaw. "Who owns it now?" Emily hesitated. "A couple from New York. They made a great offer." I closed my eyes, my mind racing. The house was gone. Strangers were living in it. and I hadn't even been given a chance to fight for it. "I can't believe you did this," I said finally. "I'm sorry," she said, but it sounded hollow. I didn't respond. I just hung up. For a few minutes I stood there, staring at the house. My grandmother's house. My family's legacy, now occupied by people I had never met. My fists clenched at my sides. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I drove away from the beach house in a haze of anger and disbelief. My hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, my mind replaying the conversation with Emily over and over again. 6 months. 6 months she had let me live in ignorance, believing that our grandmother's house was still there, waiting for me whenever I wanted to visit. She had sold it without telling me, without even asking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn around, pound on the door, and demand answers from the strangers living in what was supposed to be our shared inheritance. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the local courthouse. If Emily had managed to sell the house, there had to be paperwork. Deeds, titles, transactions. Something that would show how she had pulled this off without my signature. Because that was the part that didn't make sense. We had inherited the house together. Legally, that meant she couldn't sell it without my approval. Unless she had found a way around that. The courthouse was quiet, the afternoon lull making the process smoother than I expected. After a bit of back and forth with the clerk, I managed to get a copy of the deed transfer. The buyer was listed as Richard and Lisa Cartwright, a couple from New York, just as Emily had said. But it wasn't their names that made my stomach turn. It was the seller's name. Emily's. Just Emily's. My name was nowhere on the document. Not as a co-owner, not as someone who had signed off on the sale, nothing. It was as if I had never existed in the ownership records at all. That wasn't just a mistake, that was deliberate. I stared at the paper, my mind working through the implications. There were only a few ways this could have happened. Either Emily had committed fraud, unlikely, because she would never take that kind of legal risk, or she had found a way to gain sole control of the property, and that meant only one thing. A power of attorney. I practically ran back to my car, my heart pounding. A power of attorney document would have given Emily the legal right to act on my behalf. If she had one, she could have sold the house without my knowledge. But there was no way I had given her that kind of control. Right? I tried to think back. Had there been anything I had signed in the past that could have given her that authority? Maybe something when Grandma first passed away? Estate paperwork? A shared agreement? And then it hit me. Years ago, when I had first moved to Chicago, Emily had asked me to sign something to make it easier for her to handle the house while I was out of state. At the time, it had seemed harmless. I had been swamped with work, barely paying attention, and Emily had assured me it was just to help with maintenance and bills. Had that been a power of attorney? Had I unknowingly handed her the legal ability to sell our grandmother's house? I needed to be sure. Instead of calling Emily, because at that moment I wasn't sure I could speak to her without exploding, I drove straight to our family lawyer's office. Mr. Reynolds had handled our grandmother's estate after she passed, and if there was any legal record of me signing something that gave Emily control, he would know. The receptionist recognized me and led me into Reynolds' office without much wait. The old lawyer looked up from his desk, adjusting his glasses. "Jack," he said, his voice calm as always, "this is a surprise. What brings you here?" I didn't waste time. Did I ever sign a power of attorney for Emily? Reynolds frowned. "Why do you ask?" "Because she sold our grandmother's house without my permission," I said tightly, "and the only way she could have done that is if she had some legal authority over my share." Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "Give me a moment." He turned to his filing cabinet, flipping through folders until he pulled one out labeled Harrington Estate, our grandmother's last name. He skimmed the contents before pulling out a document and handing it to me. I barely had to read the title to know. Limited power of attorney. And there, right below the legal jargon, was my signature. I sank into the chair, my stomach twisting. I had done this. I had given her the power to act on my behalf. She told me it was just for maintenance, I muttered. She said it was just so she could pay bills while I was out of state. Reynolds nodded. And, at the time, that's exactly what she used it for. But a power of attorney can be broad or specific. This one was written to give her the ability to manage the property, which included selling it if she deemed necessary. I swallowed hard. And there was no expiration date? He shook his head. Not unless you revoked it. I hadn't. I had completely forgotten about it. And Emily had taken full advantage of that. I clenched my jaw, gripping the document tightly. So, legally? There's nothing I can do? Reynolds hesitated. It's tricky. Technically, you granted her the authority. If you could prove she acted in bad faith, say, if she misled you or had fraudulent intent, you might have a case. But it wouldn't be easy. Fraud. Misleading intent. Could I prove that? Probably not. Emily hadn't forged anything. She hadn't done anything that was outright illegal. Unethical? Absolutely. A betrayal? Without question. But a court wouldn't care about my feelings. I exhaled slowly, my mind spinning. What about Grandma's will? Was there anything in there that could help me? Reynolds scratched his chin. Her will was straightforward. The house was split between you and Emily equally, no conditions. But that didn't make sense. Our grandmother had always been sharp, always careful. Would she really have left something so important without any safeguards? Then a thought struck me. Do you still have a copy of the original will? I asked. Not the official probate version. The original. Reynolds looked mildly surprised, but nodded. Yes, I do. Why? Because Grandma was careful, I said, my pulse picking up. And if there was anything unusual, she might have written it down before the final version was drafted. Reynolds reached for another folder, pulling out a handwritten document. Our grandmother's first draft of her will. My eyes scanned the pages quickly. And then I found it. A clause. A clause that hadn't made it into the official version. My breath caught as I read it. If one heir sells the property without the consent of the other, their share of the proceeds will automatically transfer to the remaining heir. My heart pounded. Emily had sold the house without my consent, which meant, if this clause was legally binding, I was entitled to all of the money. I looked up at Reynolds, who had read the section alongside me. He raised his eyebrows. Well, he said, this changes everything. For the first time since I had arrived in Cape Cod, a slow, determined smile spread across my face. Emily had thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming next. The weight of the discovery settled over me like a storm cloud, dark, crackling with energy, and impossible to ignore. My hands clenched around the pages of my grandmother's original will, the hidden clause burning into my mind. Emily had sold the house without my consent, and according to this document, that meant every penny from the sale legally belonged to me. I looked up at Mr. Reynolds, my grandmother's longtime lawyer, who had just finished rereading the clause himself. He adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes flicking to me. Jack, I have to be honest. This is a rare situation. Wills go through multiple revisions before the final version is submitted to probate, and not all handwritten clauses remain enforceable. However, he said, tapping the page, this was in the original draft, meaning your grandmother intended for it to be included. The question now is whether we can argue that intent still carries legal weight. I nodded slowly, my mind already racing through the possibilities. But the final version of the will didn't include this clause. No, it didn't, Reynolds admitted. But we need to find out why. There was only one way to do that. I needed to see if there were any notes or explanations left behind about why the clause had been removed. My grandmother had been meticulous in all things, and I refused to believe she had simply let this go without a reason. "Where would those records be?" I asked. "Possibly in my archives, possibly in your grandmother's personal files. Did she keep legal documents at home?" "She kept everything at home," I muttered, which meant I had to go back. An hour later, I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, where boxes of my grandmother's old belongings were still stored in the attic. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked in, and she gave me a surprised look. "Jack? Twice in one day? That's rare." "I need to find something in Grandma's papers," I said, already moving toward the attic door. "Jack," she called after me, but I was already halfway up the stairs. The attic smelled like old wood and dust, a time capsule of memories packed away in boxes. I spent the next hour digging through papers, insurance forms, medical records, old photographs. Then, at the bottom of a heavy wooden chest, I found what I was looking for. A leather-bound folder labeled Estate Documents. I flipped through the pages, scanning old drafts of her will, letters to Reynolds, handwritten notes in the margins. And then, there it was. A letter dated just a few months before she passed. "To whom it may concern. Regarding the ownership of my beach house, I have chosen to remove a clause from my final will that initially ensured the sale proceeds would transfer fully to the remaining heir in case of an unauthorized sale. However, this decision was made under pressure from my granddaughter, Emily, who expressed concerns about financial flexibility. I remain firm in my original intent. The house is to be a shared inheritance, and any sale must be agreed upon by both heirs. I do not wish for one to act without the other's consent. Should any dispute arise, I ask that my original intentions be honored." I let out a slow breath. This was it. Proof that the clause had been removed under pressure, not because Grandma had changed her mind. Reynolds would know what to do with this. The next morning I sat across from him in his office, the letter placed carefully on the desk between us. He read it twice, then leaned back in his chair. "Jack, this is exactly what we needed." "So it's enforceable?" "It strengthens your case significantly," Reynolds said. "While the final will is the legal document, this letter shows that your grandmother never intended for the clause to be removed permanently. Courts take documented intent seriously, especially when there's evidence that an heir pressured the testator into making a change." I exhaled, the tension in my chest easing slightly. "So what now?" Reynolds steepled his fingers. "Now we take this to Emily." I didn't give Emily any warning. She had blindsided me, so I figured it was only fair to return the favor. I called her that afternoon and told her to meet me at a cafe near her apartment. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. She showed up looking wary, her arms crossed the moment she saw me. "Jack, if this is about the house—" "It is," I interrupted. "Sit down." She sighed but slid into the chair across from me. "Jack, I don't know what else to say. I did what I had to do." I pulled out the letter and placed it in front of her. "Read this." She frowned but picked it up. As her eyes moved over the words, I saw the moment she realized what it meant. Her face paled slightly and her grip on the paper tightened. "Where did you get this?" "Grandma kept everything," I said evenly, "including proof that you pressured her into removing a clause that would have stopped you from selling the house behind my back." Her mouth opened, then shut again. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to find an argument, an excuse, anything to undo what was now in front of her. "You don't have a case," she finally said. "The final will is the only thing that matters." I slid another document toward her. Reynolds had drafted it that morning. "This is a legal notice stating that I'm contesting the sale. If you fight me on this, I'll take you to court, and based on this letter, I'll win." Emily's jaw clenched. "You're really going to sue your own sister?" I leaned forward. "You sold our grandmother's house without telling me. You lied for 6 months. And you think I'm the bad guy here?" She looked away, anger and guilt warring on her face. "I needed the money, Jack. I was drowning." "Then you should have come to me," I said quietly. "Instead, you made the decision alone. And now, you're going to deal with the consequences." Silence hung between us for a long moment. Then she exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" "I want every cent from the sale," I said bluntly. "All of it." She stiffened. "Jack, you don't have a choice, Emily," I said. "Legally, the proceeds belong to me. If I take this to court, you'll not only lose the money, but you'll also rack up legal fees. If you cooperate, we can do this quietly." She stared at me, breathing hard. Then finally, she looked down, defeated. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll transfer the money." A part of me wanted to feel victorious, but mostly I just felt tired. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. We were family. We were supposed to protect each other. But Emily had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. As she slid the letter back to me, her fingers hesitated. "I never wanted it to be like this," she said softly. "Neither did I said. And then, without another word, I walked away. I sat in my car outside the cafe for a long time, gripping the steering wheel as the weight of everything settled over me. Emily had agreed to transfer the money, but it didn't feel like a victory. I had spent the last 24 hours uncovering deception, navigating legal loopholes, and confronting the fact that my own sister had sold a piece of our family history without a second thought about how it would affect me. And now, even with the money about to be returned to me, the house was still gone. The place where we had spent our childhood summers, where Grandma had baked us cookies and told us stories about the ocean, was now in the hands of strangers. I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive Emily for that. After a while, I started the engine and drove back to my hotel. I needed time to think, time to figure out my next move. Winning the financial battle didn't change the fact that I had lost something more valuable. The transfer happened quickly. 2 days later, I received confirmation from my bank account. Emily had wired every cent from the sale into my account. A part of me had expected her to stall, to drag it out, to fight me on some technicality, but she hadn't. Maybe she had realized there was no point, or maybe, just maybe, she had started to feel the weight of what she had done. Still, we hadn't spoken since that day in the cafe. I knew our relationship was fractured, possibly beyond repair, and I wasn't sure I had the energy to try to fix it. But there was still one thing left to do. The beach house was gone. That much was out of my hands. But the new owners, Richard and Lisa Cartwright, had no idea about the history, about what that house meant to my family. I had done some research on them. They were a retired couple from New York, looking for a quiet place to settle down. They had bought the house with the intention of making it their permanent home. I told myself there was no point in reaching out, that it was over. And yet, I found myself sitting outside their home in my car, staring at the white-painted front door that used to be Grandma's, debating whether to knock. In the end, I did. A woman in her 60s opened the door, wearing a soft blue cardigan. She looked at me curiously. "Can I help you?" I cleared my throat. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Jack Harrington. I used to own this house." Recognition flashed across her face. "Oh, you must be Emily's brother." I stiffened at the mention of her name. "Yes." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" I hadn't expected that. I don't want to intrude." "Nonsense," she said kindly. "If this was your home, I imagine you'd like to see it one last time." I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped inside. It was the same house, and yet it wasn't. The furniture was different, the walls had been repainted, and the familiar smell of salt and old wood had been replaced with the scent of fresh lavender. But underneath it all, I could still see echoes of the past. The way the light hit the living room at this time of day, the faint scratch marks on the hardwood floor from when Emily and I used to drag chairs across it, the slight dip in the stairs where Grandma's feet had worn the wood down over decades. Lisa led me to the kitchen, where her husband, Richard, was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. He looked up, surprised, as she introduced me. "I hope I'm not bothering you," I said. "Not at all," Richard said, gesturing for me to sit. Emily mentioned she had a brother, but she didn't say much. I gave a dry smile. That doesn't surprise me. Lisa poured me a cup of tea, and for the next half hour we talked. I told them about my grandmother, about the history of the house, about the summers spent here. They listened with genuine interest, asking questions, nodding along. It felt strangely cathartic, sharing these memories with people who had no stake in them, no agenda. Finally, after a pause, Richard folded his hands on the table. "Jack, I don't mean to pry, but why are you here?" I took a deep breath. I guess I needed closure. My sister and I inherited this house, and I thought it would always be in our family. I didn't know she had sold it until I showed up at the front door a few days ago. Lisa's expression softened. "That must have been hard." "It was." I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "But I don't blame you. You bought this house fair and square. And I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to see it one last time." They exchanged a glance. Then Richard leaned forward. "Jack, I don't know if this will mean anything to you, but Lisa and we don't have children. We don't have family that we'd pass this house down to. And after hearing everything you've told us, it's clear this place meant a lot to you." I frowned slightly. "What are you saying?" Lisa smiled gently. "We'd be open to selling it back to you." My heart nearly stopped. "You would?" Richard nodded. "We just moved in, and we do love it here, but it's not our legacy, it's yours. If you really want it back, we'd be willing to talk." I was stunned. I had come here expecting nothing, and now I had a choice. I spent the next week thinking, running numbers, talking to Reynolds. I had the money from Emily. It wouldn't cover the full cost of buying the house back, but it was a start, and with some financial restructuring I could make it work. But did I want to? I thought about what the house had meant to me. It wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was a symbol of family, of childhood, of memories I didn't want to lose. And maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to start fresh. So I called Richard and Lisa, and we made a deal. It wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was a symbol of family, of childhood, of memories I didn't want to lose. And maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to start fresh. So I called Richard and Lisa, and we made a deal. A month later, I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's beach house, my beach house once again. The furniture was different, the paint was new, but it didn't matter, because it was mine. And as I walked through each room, memories rushing back with every step, I realized something. I had been so angry at Emily, so hurt by what she had done. And while I still wasn't ready to forgive her, I knew this much. No matter what happened between us, I wasn't going to let her mistake define my future. I had my home back, and that was all that mattered.